I've spent the last 10 years of my life chasing criminals, uncovering secrets, and reading the body language of people trying to hide things from me. I never thought I'd have to use those same skills on my own wife. Jane was always good at keeping her emotions in check. I used to admire that about her, her composure. I'd come home after long, grueling days at the FBI, my mind filled with shadows, and she'd always be there, calm and supportive. But something changed. It was subtle at first, little things. She started locking her phone, which she'd never done before. Conversations would stop the second I walked into the room. Her laughs sounded hollow, and when she smiled, it no longer reached her eyes. I wanted to brush it off. I didn't want to be that paranoid husband, especially not as an FBI agent. Hell, I'd seen so many marriages fall apart from the sheer weight of suspicion. But once you're trained to see patterns, you can't unsee them. And the pattern was there, clear as day. Something wasn't right. The first time I noticed it was a Tuesday. Jane had gone out for drinks with her friends, something she rarely did. She came home later than expected, claiming they'd gotten caught up talking about work. The smell of perfume on her wasn't hers, and her hair was a little too perfect for a casual night out. She had a glow about her, a glow I hadn't seen in months. My instincts flared up, but I pushed the thought away. I wasn't going to be that guy. But then it started happening more often. Late nights at work, long showers when she got home, her phone constantly buzzing with messages she didn't feel the need to explain. I'm an FBI agent, for Christ's sake. I could have cracked her phone code in seconds, could have planted a tracker in her car, but I didn't. I didn't want to believe it had come to that. Instead, I did what I was trained to do: observe, wait, and collect information. A few weeks passed, and the signs were getting harder to ignore. I decided to follow her one evening. She said she was going to a friend's place, some casual wine night to catch up on old times. I tailed her from a distance, my heart pounding in my chest, feeling more like a rookie on his first undercover assignment than a seasoned FBI agent. She drove across town, far from her friend's neighborhood, to a place I didn't recognize, a small, upscale apartment complex. I watched from the shadows as she stepped out of the car, her eyes darting around nervously before heading inside. I waited. The minutes dragged on, my mind racing with possibilities. I wanted to be wrong. I wanted her to walk back out and prove me the fool. But she didn't. 2 hours passed before she emerged from the building, a man by her side. They stood close, too close. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, and she laughed. That laugh I hadn't heard in months, the one she used to reserve just for me. Then they kissed. Not a brief, guilty peck, but a kiss full of passion, of intimacy, of familiarity. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. My hands clenched the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I could feel the adrenaline surging through me, the familiar burn of betrayal mixed with fury. But I didn't move. Instead, I took a deep breath and drove away. Confronting them then would have been too easy, too impulsive. I needed to think, to plan. The next few days were hell. Every time I looked at her, all I could see was that kiss. I couldn't bring myself to touch her, to be near her. I needed evidence, something concrete before I confronted her. So I did what I was trained to do. I set up surveillance. I planted a small camera in her car, one in the living room and another in our bedroom. I hated myself for it, but I needed to know the truth, needed to see just how deep this betrayal ran. The footage didn't take long to confirm what I already knew. She was texting him, calling him, even sneaking out in the middle of the night when she thought I was asleep. The worst part? It wasn't just a fling. The way she spoke to him, the way she laughed and smiled in his presence, told me everything I needed to know. She was in love with him. That realization cut deeper than I ever thought possible. I could have exposed her right then. I had enough evidence to confront her, to tear apart the illusion of our marriage. But I wanted more. I wanted her to feel the same level of betrayal she had inflicted on me. So I waited, and I watched, biding my time. One evening, I made my move. I'd intercepted one of their messages. They were planning to meet at his apartment again. This time, I wasn't just going to watch. I slipped out of the house after she left, driving a different car, one she wouldn't recognize. When I got to the apartment, I parked a block away and made my way to his door. Picking the lock was child's play, I'd done it hundreds of times on the job. The apartment was dark and empty when I stepped inside, but I knew they'd be back soon. I wasn't there to confront them. No, I had something else in mind. I planted listening devices in his bedroom and living room, careful to make them invisible to the naked eye. I wanted to hear everything. Every whisper, every laugh, every secret they shared behind my back. I wanted to know what they said about me, about our life. And then I left, slipping out as quietly as I'd come. That night, I lay awake in bed, listening to the recordings as they unfolded in real time. Jane didn't come home until after midnight, and when she did, she climbed into bed next to me as if nothing had happened. I stayed still, my heart pounding, every fiber of my being screaming at me to confront her, to end this charade. But I didn't. Not yet. Over the next few days, I gathered everything I needed. Her texts, her calls, the recordings of her time with him. I wasn't just going to confront her. I was going to destroy the life she thought she could have with him. Then the day came. I was sitting at the kitchen table, going over the final details when she walked in, smiling like nothing was wrong. "You okay?" she asked, her voice full of concern. The nerve of her. "Yeah, just thinking about work," I lied, forcing a smile. She kissed me on the cheek, and I felt my stomach turn. Tonight would be the last time she ever touched me. Later that evening, after she had left for another one of her girls' nights, I made my move. I drove to his apartment again, but this time, I wasn't alone. I'd brought a team. Colleagues who owed me favors, professionals who knew how to handle situations like this. We didn't make a scene. We didn't need to. I had everything set in motion, and by the time I was done, her lover's entire life would be in ruins. His finances? Frozen. His job? Terminated. The evidence I'd planted would make sure he'd never work again in this town or any other. He was a criminal in my world now, with a trail of fake evidence that would make sure he spent years fighting charges he didn't understand. As for Jane, I waited for her to come home. I sat in the living room, the lights low, listening to the door open as she tiptoed inside, thinking I was asleep. When she saw me sitting there, her eyes widened in surprise. "You're up," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I am," I replied calmly, holding up the phone. "And I know everything." Her face drained of color, and for the first time in weeks, I saw real fear in her eyes. I laid it all out, her affair, the evidence, the recordings. She tried to explain, to make excuses, but I didn't want to hear it. I'd heard enough. I told her to pack her things and leave, that I'd already filed for divorce. There was nothing left to say. As she stood there, stunned, I got up, walked past her, and out of the house. It wasn't just her marriage that ended that night. It was her whole world. And for me, I drove away without looking back, feeling lighter than I had in months. The cold air hit me as I stepped outside, a sharp contrast to the suffocating tension in the house I just left. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The woman I thought I knew was a stranger now, someone who had torn apart everything we built together, one lie at a time. I headed to the car, my mind racing but my heart calm. I had done what I needed to do, and there was no turning back. As I drove through the quiet streets, I replayed the look on her face when I showed her the evidence. The disbelief, the panic, the desperation as she realized she'd lost everything. It was satisfying in a way I never expected it to be. She had thought she could get away with it, that she could live a double life right under my nose. But she didn't count on one thing. She was married to someone trained to uncover lies. I didn't head home. That wasn't my home anymore. I hadn't felt at home in that place for months, maybe longer. Instead, I drove to a place I hadn't visited in years, the lookout point where Jane and I used to go when we first started dating. Back then, the view over the city had felt like the future, wide open and full of possibilities. Now, it felt like a graveyard of broken promises. I parked the car and leaned back in the seat, staring out at the skyline, the twinkling lights of the city below. Somewhere down there, she was probably packing her things, or maybe calling her lover, trying to salvage the life she thought she could have. It didn't matter. I had already taken care of him. I had to laugh at the irony. Her lover, the man she thought she was falling in love with, had no idea what was coming. When I told my team about the situation, they didn't hesitate. He was a low-level nobody in the financial sector, but with a few well-placed accusations and some creative evidence, we'd made sure he'd never see the inside of an office again. And as far as Jane was concerned, he was just an innocent guy, caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. She'd never know the truth, that I had orchestrated every bit of his downfall. I opened my phone, scrolling through the messages between Jane and him one last time. Each word was like a knife to the gut, but it was a pain I was getting used to. They talked about running away together, about starting a new life where no one knew them. He promised her a future full of passion and excitement, everything she thought she was missing with me. It was funny, really. She thought she was trading in the mundane for something better, something thrilling. But what she didn't realize was that she had no idea who she was dealing with. I wasn't just the guy she shared a house with, the father of her child. I was the guy who could make someone disappear without a trace, the guy who could destroy lives with a few phone calls. And I'd done just that. I put the phone down and closed my eyes, letting the silence wash over me. For the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. The rage that had been building inside me was gone, replaced by a cold, clear sense of finality. I had done what needed to be done, and now it was over. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and I sat there for what felt like hours, just listening to the world around me. In the distance, I could hear the faint hum of the city, the place where Jane had thought she could start over. But there was no starting over for her. Not after this. My phone buzzed in my pocket, pulling me out of my thoughts. I glanced at the screen. One of my team members. The message was simple. It's done? That was it. 3 words, and everything was over. Her lover had been taken care of, his life unraveling just as hers was about to. I wondered how long it would take for her to realize that she wasn't running away with anyone, that she had destroyed her marriage, her family, for a man who wouldn't even be able to pick up the pieces of his own life. I started the car and drove, no particular destination in mind. I just needed to move, to put miles between me and the life I was leaving behind. The life I had been pretending was still whole when, in reality, it had been cracked for months. By the time I stopped, the sun was starting to rise. I found myself at a small motel on the edge of town, the kind of place no one asks questions and no one cares why you're there. I checked in, got a room, and collapsed on the bed, staring at the ceiling. Sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept drifting back to the confrontation, the way Jane had stammered, her eyes wide with shock as I laid it all out for her. She had tried to apologize, to explain, but there was no explanation good enough. Not for this. I had given her everything, my loyalty, my trust, and she had thrown it away for some cheap thrill. But in the end, she had lost. She had no idea the depths of the hole she was digging for herself. And now, with everything exposed, with her lover's life in shambles, she'd have to face the reality she had tried so hard to escape. It wasn't long before my phone buzzed again. This time, it was from my lawyer. The divorce papers were filed. Everything was in motion. I stared at the message for a long time, the final nail in the coffin of a marriage I thought would last forever. And then, for the first time since this all began, I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. I was free. Free from the lies, the betrayal, the weight of pretending everything was okay when it clearly wasn't. The thought was almost liberating. I'd survived 10 years of high-stakes cases, undercover missions, and facing down some of the worst criminals this country had to offer. But none of them had hurt me the way Jane's betrayal had. It was different when it was personal, but now it was over. I had gotten my revenge. I had taken back control, and as I lay there in the darkness of that motel room, I realized something else. The man she thought she knew, the one she had cheated on and lied to, was gone. The man who had been broken by her deceit didn't exist anymore. In his place was someone colder, harder, and as I closed my eyes, I wondered if she'd ever really understood who she was dealing with. Tomorrow, I would begin again. A new chapter, one without her. The morning light crept through the thin curtains, stirring me from a restless sleep. For a brief moment, disoriented by the unfamiliar motel room, I felt like I was on another undercover assignment. Then the memories rushed back in. Jane, the affair, the life I had meticulously dismantled just hours ago. The revenge, though satisfying in a cold, calculated way, hadn't brought the closure I expected. If anything, I was left with a void, a gnawing sense that this wasn't over. Something wasn't adding up. As I splashed water on my face and stared into the mirror, the nagging feeling grew. I replayed the last few months in my head. Jane's sudden shift in behavior, the late nights, the secretive phone calls. All of it pointed to the affair. But was that it? Was there something deeper she was hiding? I had destroyed her lover's life with surgical precision, and now that I had time to think, I realized I had been too focused on him, too distracted by his role to see if there was more beneath the surface. I threw my bag into the car and checked out of the motel, my mind spinning as I pulled out onto the highway. Something wasn't right. As an FBI agent, I was trained to follow my gut, to dig deeper when things didn't sit well. I'd spent years unraveling criminal networks, uncovering secrets that were buried beneath layers of deception. But in my own marriage, I had been blind. Maybe I was still blind. I needed answers. Real answers. Instead of driving aimlessly like I had the night before, I turned the car back toward the city. My phone buzzed in the seat next to me, Jane's name flashing on the screen again. I had ignored her call earlier, but now, something told me I needed to listen. I needed to hear what she had to say, not because I cared about her excuses, but because maybe, just maybe, there was something she hadn't told me. I pulled off the highway, parking in a quiet lot, and pressed play on the voicemail. Her voice was shaky, almost panicked. "Michael, I know you know about everything, but there's something you don't understand. I didn't mean for it to happen like this. Please, you need to listen to me. There's more. Much more than you think." The message cut off. More? What the hell did that mean? The voicemail hadn't been an apology or an excuse. It was a warning. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, adrenaline surging through me. My mind raced. Maybe this wasn't just about the affair. Maybe she was involved in something else, something darker. I started driving again, faster this time, heading straight to her lover's apartment. I had to know, not just about him, but about Jane. What was she hiding? My instincts were screaming at me now, louder than ever. There was something I'd missed, something she wasn't telling me, and I was going to find out. When I arrived at the apartment complex, I didn't knock. I didn't need to. I still had a key, one I'd swiped while installing the bugs. His life might be in ruins, but I wasn't finished yet. I let myself in quietly, the familiar sound of my own footsteps grounding me in what was now a battlefield. Inside, the place was eerily quiet. I scanned the room, my eyes landing on a laptop sitting on the kitchen counter. It was open, but the screen was locked. I knew this wasn't just about uncovering more of their affair. I needed to see what else was happening in their lives. With my FBI training, cracking the password was easy. What I found inside was far more than I had expected. The man wasn't just some random guy Jane had met. He was involved in something serious: bank fraud, shell companies, offshore accounts. It was a full-scale financial crime ring. But the deeper I dug, the more disturbing the connections became. Transactions tied to major criminal organizations, encrypted communications with people I recognized from old cases. How the hell was Jane mixed up in this? Then I found something that made my blood run cold. A folder labeled Project Hollow. Inside were photos of me, surveillance shots. Someone had been following me for months. There were pictures of me at work, at home, even on cases I thought were classified. This wasn't just about an affair. This was about me. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. Jane hadn't just been unfaithful. She was involved in something bigger, something that had targeted me. Had she been spying on me the entire time? Feeding information to this criminal network? The affair had been a cover, a way to get close to someone who could manipulate her, but also a way to keep me distracted while they used her to dig into the FBI. My stomach churned as I realized the extent of her betrayal. This wasn't just about love. This was professional. She had been playing me from the start, and now I was in danger. I copied the files, wiping the laptop as I left the apartment. I couldn't risk tipping them off, that I knew. Not yet. As I drove, my mind raced through the possibilities. If Jane was part of this, then everything, our marriage, our life together, had been a lie. She hadn't just cheated on me. She had compromised me, put my career, my life, and possibly the safety of my colleagues in jeopardy. I needed to act fast. Instead of heading home, I drove straight to the FBI field office, my mind whirling. The moment I walked in, I pulled my team together, those I trusted implicitly, and briefed them on everything. We had to move quickly before Jane and her associates knew I was onto them. We set up surveillance on her, using the same tactics I had employed against her lover. We tracked her calls, her movements, her communications. It didn't take long before she made a critical mistake. A late-night phone call. A conversation I wasn't meant to hear, but I did. "We have to move on Michael now," she whispered. "He's getting too close. If he finds out what we've been doing." I didn't need to hear the rest. I knew what I had to do. That night, as Jane sat in our living room, pretending everything was normal, I made my move. The FBI agents I had brought in surrounded the house, waiting for my signal. I watched her from the doorway, my heart pounding, my mind numb. "Michael, is something wrong?" she asked, her voice soft, concerned. I stared at her, the woman I had once loved, and saw the truth for what it was. She had never been the person I thought she was. Everything had been a lie. "Wrong," I said, my voice steady. "No, Jane, nothing's wrong." The agents moved in, surrounding her before she could react. Her eyes widened in shock, then fury, as the handcuffs clicked into place. You did this," she spat, her mask finally dropping. I looked her dead in the eyes, the weight of years of betrayal and lies pressing down on me. "You underestimated me, Jane." She struggled as they took her away, still trying to spin her lies, still trying to manipulate. But it was over. This time, I had all the evidence, not just of her affair, but of the conspiracy she had been part of, the one she had thought she could hide from me. As they drove her away, I stood on the front porch, watching the taillights disappear into the night. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel relief, just an empty kind of exhaustion. I had destroyed the life I thought I had, but in its place, I had uncovered something far darker. The life I had known was over, but at least now, I knew the truth. And as an FBI agent, that's all I ever needed. The silence that followed Jane's arrest was deafening. The house felt alien without her in it, like a stage after the curtain falls. I stood in the doorway, watching the taillights disappear into the distance, feeling the crushing weight of what had just happened settle in. She was gone. My wife, the woman I had shared a life with for over a decade, was being taken into custody, not for the betrayal of the affair, though that had ripped me apart in its own right. No, it was far deeper than that. Jane had been part of a criminal conspiracy, using our marriage, using me, to gather intel, to undermine the very agency that I had devoted my life to. She had played me perfectly, hidden in plain sight. I closed the door quietly behind me and leaned against it, letting out a long breath. There wasn't time for reflection. This was far from over. Jane had been caught, but her web extended beyond just the two of us. There were others, her lover, yes, but also the criminal network she had tied herself to. The same network that had been keeping tabs on me. I had seen the photos of myself, the surveillance files on my cases. I was compromised, and that put everyone around me at risk. I needed to act fast. I went upstairs to the bedroom we once shared, but it felt like a crime scene now, one filled with the evidence of her deception. Her phone, her personal computer, things I hadn't bothered to touch before because I trusted her. Now, everything in this house was a potential lead. I started with her laptop. The password was easy. She hadn't changed it since we'd met. That was the thing about Jane. She always liked to keep things appearing normal, even when everything was falling apart underneath. The screen flickered to life, and immediately, I saw encrypted folders. Jane was careful, but she wasn't invincible. I knew how to crack basic encryption. Years in the bureau had taught me more than enough to get into her files. It took time, but I finally got in. What I found was more than I had expected. There were files, documents detailing FBI operations, ongoing investigations, sensitive cases I had worked on, and others I hadn't. She had access to things I didn't even know she could get her hands on. But there was more than just intel. There were bank statements, large transfers of money to offshore accounts, names of people I recognized from old cases. It was a trail of corruption, tying her not just to financial fraud but to arms deals, data leaks, and illegal surveillance. My heart pounded as I realized how deep this went. Jane had been living a double life for years, right under my nose. The affair was just the tip of the iceberg, a way to distract me while she fed information to criminal organizations. She wasn't just a pawn in this game. She was a key player. Then I found it. A message, buried deep in her encrypted communications, sent just days before I discovered her affair. It was from someone high up, a name that sent a chill down my spine. Hector Valdez. Valdez was a ghost, a shadowy figure who had eluded law enforcement for years. He was involved in everything: money laundering, arms trafficking, cybercrime. No one had ever been able to pin him down, but here he was, communicating directly with Jane. The message was simple but damning. You have 1 week. If he gets any closer, take care of it. Don't leave anything behind. He was talking about me. I stared at the screen, my pulse racing. This wasn't just about them spying on me anymore. They were planning to take me out. Jane had been tasked with keeping me distracted, off their trail, but now that I was getting too close, she had been given the order to eliminate me. I thought about the times I had woken up in the middle of the night, feeling uneasy, catching her staring at me from across the room. At the time, I'd brushed it off as her feeling guilty about the affair. Now I knew better. She had been weighing her options, figuring out how to neutralize me without raising suspicion. I had been sleeping next to a woman who was calculating my death. The adrenaline surged again, but this time it wasn't fear. It was cold, hard determination. Valdez and his network had made a mistake. Jane had failed, and now I was onto them. I had what I needed to take them down, to dismantle the entire operation piece by piece. I grabbed my phone and called in the team. There was no time to waste. I knew Jane had friends in high places, people who would protect her if they found out I had her in custody. We needed to move fast before her arrest triggered any countermeasures from Valdez or his associates. By the time I reached the field office, my team had already started digging into the files I'd pulled from Jane's computer. We mapped out her connections, identified her handlers, and began to trace the money. It wasn't just a local operation. It spanned multiple states, countries even. Jane had been part of an international crime syndicate, and they had used our marriage as the perfect cover. One of my colleagues, Danny, walked over to me, his face grim. "Mike, we've got a problem," he said, sliding a document across the desk. "We just intercepted a signal. Jane's contacts are on the move. It looks like Valdez knows we have her. They're planning something, and whatever it is, it's going down tonight." I stared at the document, my mind working at lightning speed. Valdez was ruthless. If he knew Jane had been compromised, he wouldn't hesitate to clean house. That meant Jane was in danger, but more importantly, so was Emily, our daughter. "How far has it gone?" I asked, already knowing the answer but hoping I was wrong. "Far," Danny replied. "We've tracked movement in and out of the country. Looks like Valdez activated a few of his hit squads. If we don't move now, they'll eliminate anyone tied to this, including you." And Emily, I thought, panic swelling in my chest. I hadn't seen my daughter in days, too caught up in unraveling Jane's lies. But now she was part of this, whether I wanted to believe it or not. Jane might be in custody, but Valdez didn't play by the rules. He didn't care about collateral damage. If he thought Emily was leverage or a loose end, he wouldn't hesitate. I grabbed my jacket and headed for the door, motioning for Danny to follow. "We need to get Emily out of there," I said, my voice tight. "We secure her first, then we deal with Valdez." The drive to my house was a blur, my heart hammering with every mile. I had never felt fear like this, not even in the most dangerous operations I'd been a part of. This was personal. This was my daughter. I couldn't afford to make a mistake. When I pulled up to the house, everything looked normal, too normal. Emily's school bag was sitting on the porch where she'd left it the day before. The front door was slightly ajar, which sent every alarm in my body screaming. I drew my weapon, signaling Danny to cover the side entrance as I moved in through the front. The house was silent. I stepped inside, every nerve on high alert. My heart dropped when I saw the mess in the living room. Furniture overturned, pictures smashed on the floor. It hadn't been like this when I left. Someone had been here. "Emily?" I called, my voice low but firm. No answer. I moved through the house methodically, checking each room, my gun raised. The silence was suffocating. Finally, I reached Emily's bedroom. The door was half closed, and I nudged it open with the barrel of my gun. There she was, Emily, curled up on the floor, her eyes wide with fear. But she wasn't alone. Standing behind her, gun pressed to her head, was a man I recognized instantly. Hector Valdez. He smiled when he saw me, his dark eyes glittering with malice. "You're too late, Agent Donovan," he said, his voice smooth and mocking. "Jane told you half the truth, but she left out the part where you lose everything." My hands tightened on the gun, my heart pounding. He had my daughter. And suddenly, the real fight began. Time seemed to slow as I stared at Valdez, his hand firm on the gun pressed against Emily's head. My daughter's wide eyes locked onto mine, filled with terror. Every fiber of my being screamed to act, to pull the trigger and take him down. But I couldn't. Not yet. One wrong move, and she was gone. I needed to think like an agent, not like a father. Emotions cloud judgment, and in my line of work, that gets people killed. Valdez was expecting me to snap, to lose control, but I couldn't afford to give him the upper hand. He thrived on chaos, on pushing people to make mistakes. Not today. Today, I had to be the calm in the storm. "Let her go, Valdez," I said, keeping my voice steady, my gun trained on him. "You don't need her. This is between you and me." He smiled again, his eyes glinting with amusement. "It's always been between us, hasn't it? But you were too blind to see it. You thought this was about Jane? About your marriage?" He shook his head, almost pitying me. "She was just a tool, a means to an end. The real target was always you, Michael." I didn't flinch. I couldn't let him see that he was getting to me. "You think this ends with me? You think you can just walk out of here?" Valdez tilted his head slightly, still holding Emily close. "You're right. It doesn't end with you. It ends with her." His voice softened dangerously as he glanced down at Emily, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something cold and deadly in his gaze. That's when I realized the full weight of the game he'd been playing. Jane's betrayal, the affair. It was all part of a larger plan to distract me, to weaken me. He didn't just want to ruin my career or compromise the FBI. He wanted to take away everything that mattered to me, starting with my daughter. But Valdez didn't know one crucial thing. He thought he was in control, but I'd already set the pieces in motion the moment I'd walked into the house. While I was talking to him, Danny and the team had circled the perimeter. They had clear shots, and all I had to do was give the signal. "I'll make you a deal, Valdez," I said, lowering my gun just slightly to keep him engaged. "You walk away now, and I'll let you go. No one else has to get hurt. You don't want to drag this out. We both know how this ends." His smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He didn't trust me, but he was listening. He was playing the odds, trying to calculate if I was bluffing. I could see the gears turning in his head, but he was still holding his ground. His grip on Emily tightened. "You're not in a position to bargain, Donovan. You've already lost. I'll kill her before you even pull the trigger." My mind raced, searching for the opening I needed. I glanced at Emily, who was trembling but watching me carefully. She was scared, but she trusted me. She knew I wouldn't let anything happen to her. I took a slow breath, calming the adrenaline surging through my veins. I needed to keep him talking, keep him focused on me, and not on the fact that he was surrounded. I tilted my head slightly, signaling to Danny through my earpiece, a signal I hoped Valdez didn't catch. "You think you're going to walk out of here alive?" I asked, my voice dropping low, hard. "You won't make it 10 feet. My team is already outside. They've got sniper positions on every window, every door. You're done, Valdez." He laughed, but it was strained. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" I stepped forward, just a little, just enough to push him off balance. "Look around you. You know how we operate. You know how I operate. This whole house has been locked down since the moment you stepped inside. You think you've been controlling this situation, but the truth is, you've been walking into a trap." Valdez's eyes flickered to the window, just for a second, and that was all I needed. His attention shifted, and in that moment, Emily, my smart, brave girl, moved. She dropped to the floor, ducking under his arm with a speed that caught even me by surprise. I didn't hesitate. The second she was clear, I pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, loud and final, echoing through the house. Valdez staggered back, the gun dropping from his hand as he collapsed against the wall. Blood blossomed from his chest, his eyes wide with shock, but there was no time for words. He was finished. I rushed forward, grabbing Emily and pulling her into my arms, my heart pounding as I held her close. "It's okay," I whispered, more to myself than to her. "You're safe now. It's over." She clung to me, her small arms wrapped around my neck, and I felt the weight of everything crashing down on me. The betrayal, the lies, the danger I had brought into her life. But she was safe. That was all that mattered now. Danny and the rest of the team burst into the house, securing the scene. Valdez was already dead by the time they reached him. His reign of manipulation and terror had finally come to an end. I carried Emily out of the house, the cool night air hitting my face like a wave of relief. The weight of the last few weeks, the lies, the betrayal, everything. It all seemed to evaporate now that I had her in my arms. As we reached the street, Danny clapped a hand on my shoulder. "Good work, Mike," he said quietly. "It's over." But I knew it wasn't over. Not really. Valdez was dead, but the aftermath of everything Jane had done would take time to unravel. The sting of her betrayal would linger, and I would have to live with the knowledge that the woman I'd loved had nearly destroyed my life. But she hadn't won. In the end, I was still standing. I had my daughter. I had my integrity. And I had the truth. As I looked down at Emily, her small hand gripping mine, I realized that was all that really mattered. The storm had passed, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I could breathe again. Tomorrow, I'd deal with the fallout. Tomorrow, I'd face the world and the questions that would come. But tonight, I was just a father who had protected his daughter, and that was enough. And that's how it ended. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment your thoughts below.